Okay, hello everyone. So today we're going to discuss the different types of pay structures. Now, just like any other chapter, the learning objectives for the current chapter will be that we are going to see what do we mean by a grade and what is the meaning of a pay structure. Then we are going to explain the different characteristics of a pay structure, and then one by one we will be explaining, or I'll be explaining the different types of pay structures that exist in different organizations. Moving on to the next slide, a pay structure. Now, a pay structure is basically a collection of grades. Sometimes they are called levels. At other times, in other structures, they are called bands. And we place jobs in a hierarchy. So basically, a pay structure is a hierarchy of jobs. Why do we need this hierarchy? Because the hierarchy will provide a framework for the implementation of reward strategies and policies within the organization. Without this framework, we cannot implement the policies because you need some infrastructure for policy implementation. And pay structure provides that infrastructure for policy and strategy implementation. Now, pay structures, these are also known as salary structures, and these set out the different levels of pay for different jobs or groups of jobs, but with reference to. It means taking into consideration. With reference to what? With reference to internal equity, external equity, and sometimes even pays are negotiated for different jobs. We have already studied in detail the concept of internal equity, which means sometimes the rates of pay or the salaries for different jobs are determined by taking the evaluation of those jobs inside the organization, and we call it internal equity. Sometimes we take the market equity into consideration. It means the average market rates which are being offered to different jobs in the labor market. And at times, even we negotiate pay for different jobs. Well, when do we negotiate? It depends on the organization, it depends on the nature of the job. Anyways, we are going to discuss the negotiation part in a while. So these are the three references based on which our pay structure will be developed. The next slide is that why do organizations need a pay structure? Now, just like I told you, without a pay structure, there will be no implementation of pay policies. So this is the framework, the infrastructure inside which we implement the pay policy. The other thing is we determine the levels of pay. Now, because in an organization, jobs are of different levels, and we cannot pay all of the jobs the same payment. We have to differentiate between different jobs according to their value to the organization and then pay the jobs accordingly. So a pay structure will give me those levels according to which I'll be making payment to different jobs in the organization. Then this structure will help me in effective management of the pay and the pay relativities. Now, what do we mean by relativity? Relativity again refers to the internal equity of a job. The more valuable a job is to the organization, definitely that job needs to be paid higher. But then again, it cannot be done randomly. For this, we need a structure inside which we can make a hierarchy of the jobs. And then with each hierarchy, each level, we can attach a monetary value to it, a salary to it. Only then we can effectively manage jobs as well as people, as well as their performance in the organization. The next point is that the pay system is used to monitor and control the implementation of pay practices. Now, what do we mean by monitor and control? It means, okay, now that I have a system, now that I know what is the salary which is being paid to different jobs, but then again, people who are performing these jobs, they need to be monitored properly. And this means This structure provides me a base where I can monitor their activities. For more valuable jobs, more will be the expectation of the organization because the higher is the payment made to such jobs. So, as a supervisor, I have to make sure that a particular XYZ job, which is more valuable to the organization, is contributing more to the organization. And the pay structure provides me that platform from where I can keep a check on my jobs and their contribution to the organization. Anyways, in our discussion, I will be further elaborating this point, but right now I'm leaving it over there. Later on, you can ask me questions and I can explain it to any length. The next point is we communicate pay opportunities by using the pay structure. Now, the employees should be knowing, like, if you place him in a particular XYZ level, grade, or hierarchy in the pay structure, the employee is not going to remain there forever because with the passage of time, when he gains more experience, when he becomes more qualified and more proficient in his job, he wants to move ahead in the hierarchy. So the pay structure communicates what are the opportunities available for an employee in order to move up the ladder. That is the hierarchy of the jobs. So this basically clarifies them their career paths inside an organization. Now, there are so many types of pay structures, it would be impossible for me to discuss all of those structures that exist in different organizations. However, I will stick to the 7 main structures because these are the commonly used ones and they are used in almost all of the organizations around the world. These structures include the graded pay structure, then we have the individual spot rates, also known as the individual ranges. Then we have the broad banding, we have the pay spines, and the job families. These are the different types of pay structures. One by one, I'll be explaining each structure in detail. Starting from the very first one, that is the graded pay structure. This is the most important pay structure. Why? Because a graded pay structure usually provides a foundation for almost all other pay structures that exist. What is a grade? A grade is a basic unit for a graded pay structure, and just like I told you, a graded pay structure provides a foundation for all other pay structures in an organization. So grade is the basic unit of almost all pay structures that exist anywhere in the world. Yet a graded structure is also referred to as a separate pay system. Graded structure in itself is considered as a separate system as well as it is the basic unit of all the other pay structures. A graded pay system or a pay structure comprises of different grades. A grade is a collection of jobs that are similar in nature and they have somewhat similar worth to the organization. Grades, how do we determine them? Well, over here you have to recall the previous chapter where we used a scattergram. Now, what was the purpose of a scattergram? The scattergram was used for making a wage trend line. And how did we develop the wage trend line? By matching internal equity with external equity. So all the jobs are evaluated in organization, they are reflected in the scattergram and their positions are shown on the wage trend line. Grades can be formulated by taking the cluster of points on the scattergram and then making a grade out of it. All of the clusters in the scattergram are identified and each cluster of jobs comprises a separate grade. So a cluster is simply a collection of jobs that are reflected on the wage trend line, which have either somewhat similar internal equity or which have either somewhat similar payment in the market, or the nature of those jobs is similar, or simply the points which they have earned by using a point method, they are similar. I hope you have understood what do we mean by a cluster of jobs, because the cluster will formulate a grade. Putting different clusters of jobs together will formulate grades, and putting all the grades together will provide a hierarchy which is known as the pay structure, or in this case, the graded structure. When we attach a monetary value to each grade, it becomes a graded pay structure. Previously, it was just a graded structure when we made the grades and then put them in a hierarchy. But when you attach a monetary value to it, it becomes the graded pay structure. Grades are also expressed as job evaluation points. I have already discussed this point with you. For example, we can make a grade of, let's say, all of those jobs which are worth 100 to 200 points. So we can make a grade out of a collection of internal equity from 100 to 200. So all the jobs which fit into this much worth for the organization will be considered as a separate grade. Then again, all the jobs which have scored from 201 to 300 points, we can make a separate grade for those jobs, so on and so forth. Moving on to the next point, the graded pay structure, or a grade in a pay structure, has two main features. Every grade has a pay range, and in every range, there is scope for progression. Explaining the very first point, which is every grade has a pay range. What do we mean by this? This means that every grade, whether you want to call it a band, a level, or whatever, it has a minimum point, which is the starting point, the starting salary of a grade. And it has a maximum point, the ending point, or the maximum salary which is being offered to a particular job or a particular cluster of jobs in that particular grade. In the scale, okay, from time to time, I would be interchangeably using the pay range with the scale because it means one and the same thing. So a range or a pay scale also has a midpoint, and that midpoint is set with reference to either internal equity, external equity, or a combination of both. Usually, the midpoint is the intersecting point of the two types of equities, which determines the midpoint of a range. And we also call it the reference point. Moreover, the midpoint can be set entirely by a single approach. So it is totally the choice of the managers, whether they just want to rely on internal relativities, or they just want to rely on external relativity, or they want to employ both internal and external equities, relativities, and set the midpoint. However, setting midpoint is usually done by taking both the equities into consideration, because that will yield a more realistic job rates for different jobs in the organization. Now, if the rate is set only using external equity, then the reference or the midpoint is the average market rate, which is also known as the going rate for jobs in the market or a particular job in the market. But if the midpoints are set taking the internal equity, then only the job evaluation points will be used for determining the midpoint of a range. Moreover, the midpoints are also affected by the pay policy of the company. In the previous lecture, I have discussed how the pay policy of a company affects the midpoints or the rates of different jobs in the organization. That is, if you have, let's say, a match policy, then your pays will be in accordance to the wage trend line, which was determined by a scattergram. If your pay policy is lead the market, then the entire trend line will be shifted upwards. If the organization has a pay policy which lacks a market, then the entire trend line will move downwards. So this is how it will affect even the midpoints of the range or a scale. Okay, over here I have to discuss one more point, and this is very much important. When I say midpoint is the reference point, some companies, they fix the reference point at the beginning of the scale, whereas some companies fix the reference point at the middle of the scale. Wherever you fix the reference point, it refers to 100% of the range, which means that pay which is given to a fully proficient person who is performing in that particular grade with reference to the market. Now, this is important where you set your midpoint or where you set your reference point, because all the other components of the pay will be determined once you set the midpoint of a job. I will further explain these reference points in my direct interaction with you people in the class, because I want to display some figures, and using those figures, I will be explaining it to you, and even if possible, we can do a very simple calculation. So I leave it over here, and I repeat one more time that the reference point, which is 100% of the rate paid to a fully proficient person, and that rate is taken from the market. It can be set either at the starting point of the scale, or it can be set at the mid of the scale. Okay, the next component or the feature of a grade is the pay progression. What do you mean by pay progression? Pay progression means, because you have a range in a grade, a range means it has a starting point and an ending point. It has a minimum and a maximum point. So how does an employee move from a minimum point to a maximum point? Now, definitely, he is not going to jump from the minimum to the maximum point the next day after joining the job. So there must be a mechanism through which he can move or progress in his scale. Again, remember 100% is usually the reference point or the market rate for the job. It is the rate of pay which is given to a fully competent or proficient person who can perform all the aspects of a job in a very proper way. Now, generally, there are two ways to progress in a pay scale or in a pay range. We call it the old type or the fixed incremental system, or it can be the modern type where progression is linked to an individual's performance, experience, or some other criteria. Talking about the old type, the fixed incremental type. Now, you must be knowing that in the public sector, what happens that when you induct a person in a particular grade, he is usually kept at the starting point of that grade, scale, or range. When he spends 1 year in that organization performing that job, he has become entitled to one increment which is given at the end of the year. We call it that the employee has earned the increment because of the length of time that he has spent in the organization. And usually increments are given on annual basis. So this is how a person will slowly and gradually move from a minimum point in the scale to the maximum point in the scale. It can take several years for his movement to reach from one point to another. In the new system, where an employee increment is not entirely linked to the length of service, but it is linked to some sort of criteria which reflects his performance or competency level, or it can be a combination of both. The time spent in the organization as well as the employee contribution to the organization. So it means at the end of the year, the management will assess the performance of the employees and then make a decision that whether an increment should be given to him or not, or whether a certain portion of the increment should be given to that person. So this time, the increment which is earned by an employee is not automatic, but it is based on his performance on the job. Oh, well, I hope the graded pay structure is somewhat clear to you. If not, we will be discussing it in our next lecture, and I'll take all of your questions in the interactive session. The next system or the pay structure is the individual rates or the spot rates. Also closely related to this system is the individual ranges. Now, what do we mean by an individual pay rate or a spot rate? Individual pay rates involve a fixed salary which is based on an employee's job role within the organization. This means there is no movement from one point to another, which implies there is no range in a particular job. Whatever pay you offer to the employee, you will keep on giving him the same pay, whether it is in the beginning of the year or whether it is after 2 years, because it is a spot rate, a rate that has been fixed on a particular spot, no movement in that in the salary or no advancement in the salary because we don't have a range where the employee can advance. There are different reasons why we should adopt an individual pay rate, but one of the common reasons is that those organizations which are very small in size, for them it is easy to adopt a spot rate because they don't have too many employees or too many job titles. Let's say they only have 5 job titles, so they can easily decide which particular title should be given how much pay. That's it. But sometimes even in a graded structure, we can use spot rates. Some of the people which are dearly or which are really needed by the organization, and the organization want to retain them. So rather than putting them on a graded structure, the managers offer them a lump sum salary. Now, usually this lump sum salary is much higher than what other people are getting in the pay structure. But these will be just few people which are really required by the organization. And maybe such people are either rare in the market, maybe their services are so valuable that the organization cannot let go of them. So then spot rates are fixed and they are offered a separate pay which does not fit into the structure. Anyways, these are the different decisions which are taken by the managers. Okay, what is the individual pay range? Now, in the previous slide, I discussed about the spot rate. The spot rate is a rate that you fix at a particular point, and that is it. We don't have any range. But now, the disadvantage of a spot rate is that the employee cannot progress. It means if I spend 1 year getting the same salary, and the next year again I'm getting the same salary, and the third year again I'm getting the same salary. So it demotivates the employee. He doesn't have anything to look forward to. So in order to remove the dissatisfaction or to reduce the dissatisfaction of an employee, we attach a range with a spot salary. Let's say if you have fixed the spot salary at 10,000 rupees. Now, attaching a range means we can set a minimum point for this and we can set a maximum point for this. So the minimum point for the 10,000 spot rate can be 5,000 rupees and the maximum can be 15,000. However, you can always set the minimum and maximum points as it suits the organization. So individual pay ranges involve a fixed salary based on an employee's job role within the organization. But this salary has a range, a minimum and maximum point attached to it. The advantage of this approach is that it is easy to manage and it motivates the employees. The next one is, okay, I missed one point over here, a graded pay structure. A graded pay structure can take any of these two forms, a narrow graded pay structure and a broad graded pay structure. Please do not confuse it with the broad banding system. The two are different from each other. When is a graded structure, pay structure narrow? In a narrow structure, basically, we have several levels of job hierarchy. Typically, any structure that has more than 10 hierarchical levels of jobs are considered as narrow structures. We also call the nanostructures as stall pay structures. And these are the structures which we see in the public sector. In such structures, just like I have discussed it in the previous slides, the progression is by means of service. So an employee spends 1 year, he earns one increment. He spends 2 years, he earns two increments. And this is how he can progress from one point to another. Over here, I have given a figure. And in this figure, you can see that it is a tall structure which has several levels of pay hierarchy. Now, the next one is the broaded pay structure. Broaded pay structure has all the characteristics of the graded pay structure or the narrow pay structure, except that it is that structure in which the levels of job hierarchy are either 10 or less than 10. This means if you have a pay structure where you have 6 grades, 7 grades, 8 grades, 5 grades, it will be considered as a broad graded pay structure. The difference between a narrow graded pay structure and a broad graded pay structure is that in the broad graded pay structure, we have simply collapsed the several grades into one grade. So we call such structures as flat structures. Over here you can see in the figure as compared to the previous one. This is the previous one, the narrow graded pay structure, and this is the broad graded pay structure. In the broad graded pay structure, we have fewer levels of job hierarchy, whereas in the narrow one, we have several levels of pay hierarchy. Okay, we move on to the next pay system, and that is the broad banding pay system. Broad banding involves grouping of jobs into very broad grades, but this time we do not use the word grade for it. We use the word band for it. So again, in a broad banded pay structure, the entire job hierarchy will fit into 4, 5, maybe 6 bands, and that's it. So in a pay structure, you will be having around 4, 5, 6 hierarchical levels. But this time, the grades are not called grades, but they are referred to as bands. And band has a much wider scope, width, range as compared to a graded pay structure. There are other striking differentials as well between a graded pay structure and a broad banded pay structure. Over here, it is important to explain that pay grades, that what are pay grades and how they work. Pay grades, just like I told you, the basic feature is that it has a minimum and a maximum point. The same is the case with the range. In a broad banded pay structure, we have different bands. Every band has a minimum point and a maximum point. Employees, they will begin at the bottom of the pay grade or range, and then they will move up and they will reach the maximum point. But this time, in a broad banded pay structure, their movement will be determined up to a certain extent by the length of service, and after that extent, it will be determined by the performance of the employee. So in the first few years, an employee movement might be automatic. Every year he earns an increment. But after a few years, now he will not be given any automatic increment. He has to earn that increment on the basis of his performance or some other criteria, which is set by the organization. Okay, so in a broad banded pay structure, there are certain important components that you need to understand. First, the grade is not called a grade anymore. This is known as a band. Every band has a title. Like a grade does not have a title, but a band will be having a title. For example, we can have a band of professionals. We can have a band of managerial employees, or we can have some other band. Totally depends on which sort of jobs exist in your organization. We will be looking at the different types of bands and the titles which can be determined for them or set for them. So over here we have a band. Number 2, every band has a title. Number 3, just like a graded pay system, a band has a virtual, not an actual, minimum point and maximum point. When I say virtual, I will explain it further in a while. But what is present inside this band? We need to understand that first. Inside the band, we have different zones. For example, in a single band, we can have 3 different zones, or we can have 4 different zones. What is a zone? A zone is basically a collection of different job roles which fit in a particular band. For example, inside the band of professionals, we can fit the professionals further into 3 different zones depending upon the roles that they are performing in the band of a professional. And then in a particular zone, I repeat again, in a particular zone, we can have a minimum point and a maximum point. So if you have 3 zones in a band, zone 1, zone 2, zone 3. In zone 1, you have a minimum point and a maximum point. And these can be, for example, the lowest level of professionals who are working in that particular band or who can be fitted into that particular band. A slightly higher level of professionals who are performing slightly higher level of roles in the category or in the label of professional band. Again, for such people, we have the second zone, zone 2. Zone 2 again has a minimum point and a maximum point. And the same thing is repeated in the third zone. Now, if you see, band is just a collection of these 3 zones. So that is why it does not have an actual minimum point and an actual maximum point. Because the band's minimum and maximum point are taken from the minimum point of zone 1 and the maximum point of zone 3 if you have 3 zones in a band. So the minimum point of zone 1 will become the minimum point of a band, and the maximum point of zone 3 will become the maximum point of a band. And every zone has a midpoint. Every zone has a midpoint, and that midpoint is set with reference to the market. So I hope I'm clear. I mean, I have clarified myself. Okay, the next slide is talking about the pay spines. Now, this is a very interesting pay structure. And in majority of the universities in the United Kingdom and elsewhere, they are using these structures, which is working quite efficiently. So a pay spine, it is a company-wide pay structure that is especially effective due to its simplicity and clarity. Pay spines, they cover all wages within the organization, from the lowest level entry salary to the senior managerial or even executive level pay. It means every job will be covered in this pay spine. But the spine is made up of individual pay points. Now this time we do not have as such a cluster or a range, but this time we will be having a fixed point for each job in the organization. These are very tall structures because a single structure can comprise of 50 points, maybe 100 points. So the structure is very tall. Now, in order to make it more manageable, the points are grouped together. The points, these are grouped together, and each group of points forms a grade. So we will group together, let's say, the starting point or the starting rate of any job in the organization. We can maybe include 5, 6, 7, 8 different points, and we call it as a grade. So now we have a collection of points in our first grade. Then again, where we have stopped, for example, up to 8 points we have covered in our first grade. So 8 points onward, I will include another number of points and make another grade out of it. So for example, from 8 onward, I can take it up to 12 points, 13 points, 15 points, whatever you deem fit. This is how we make a grade. But from the pay rates for individual jobs or the pay points of individual jobs. This is how a pay spine. Right? Now you can see this is a very tall structure, although over here I haven't shown the entire structure, but these are a series of incremental points and the structure is usually very tall. I repeat one more time, the spine is made up of individual pay points and each pay point has a predefined salary and incremental increases. Each role is then assigned to a range of pay points. Each job is then assigned to a range of pay points. And an employee can move in this grade or range, whatever you want to call it, according to his length of service. The advantages of this type of system is that the path to payment increases. The path to payment increases, which simply means the increments are clear to the employees. They know that, for example, in a few years' time, I would reach this point in the grade. For example, if I have started from the first point, so in 3 years' time, I'm going to reach to the third or fourth point in my grade. And you already have a fixed salary with that particular point. So I know what will be my salary after 3 years when I'm performing in that particular grade. So it is very easy for the employee because he can clearly see his pay as well as the point that he can reach while he is performing his service. Now you can see over here, these are some of the actual diagrams that I have taken from some university websites. This is how it looks like. Again, now in this diagram, I would like to just tell you one more thing. For example, over here we have three different grades. Grade number 1 includes point 1 up to point 5. Grade number 2 includes point 6 onwards till point 11, and grade number 3 includes point 12 and it goes up to point 17. Now over here you can see this yellow highlighted box. Is it a part of the grade? Well, sort of. We can say yeah, it is, but not exactly. Now in the first grade you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 blue boxes. These are the incremental points. This means if you recruit a person and you put him on the first point of the spine, which has a monetary value attached to it, after 1 year of his performance of job, spending 1 year in the organization, he will move to the second point. And now he clearly knows what will be the salary when he reaches the second point. So he keeps on moving, and for every point, he is very much clear about the payment that he is going to receive from the organization. But when he reaches the fifth point, Now, what happens over here? There is no more automatic increment. He will keep on receiving the salary which is linked to this point unless and until he shows some extraordinary performance. And if his performance is consistent throughout the year, only then he will be given the salary of zero point 0.6 in the pay spine. So this yellow box is the additional salary or the additional point which the employee has earned through his performance, and he has enhanced in his salary by earning that additional point. The last structure is the job family. Job families are pay structures which strike a balance between many of the other common pay systems. Job families, they operate by grouping similar roles together and putting each individual role based on their knowledge and seniority. Now, that seems to be a bit confusing. So, I'll straight away go to the diagram and explain it from here. Now, for example, over here you can see the different blocks. And then the different colored boxes, they are grouped into 3 columns. These 3 columns or 3 bars are 3 job families in an organization. For example, in this particular organization, we have a family of operation, we have a family of finance, and we have a family of IT. But inside each family, there is a collection of similar roles or similar jobs. For example, in the family of IT, all of the people who are placed in this family will be performing the work that is related to IT. In the family of a finance, all of the jobs which fit into the family of finance will be doing some sort of finance related jobs, and in the job family of operation, all of the jobs will have relevance with operation. Okay, if this is clear, then one more thing that I need to explain. Now, if you see in these bars, there are different colored boxes. This means if I put a person in the IT family, now in the IT, there will be several jobs and several people performing those jobs. So in the IT family, all of the jobs are not going to be of the same level. There will be a difference of level in these jobs. For example, an IT person who is working in the lab is not going to be at the same level of the IT manager. So there is a difference of these 2 jobs, and each block shows that there are so many different levels of jobs included in that particular family, and each level has to be paid differently, although they fall into the same family, yet in the same family, their level of job is different. So their salaries should be different. Okay, this was all about our pay systems. The rest, I can take your questions, I can clarify anything which is not clear to you, but that will be in our interactive session. Thank you so much.